I'm glad you're joining us on Radio Free Georgia's In Tune to Nature program. I'm host Carrie Freeman, coming to you from Atlanta in June of 2022. Today, we're going to be talking about ways to ensure public health, such as preventing pandemics and the continued effectiveness of antibiotics through dealing with the risks posed by animal agribusiness, as outlined in a new documentary, The End of Medicine. Our guest is a whistleblower veterinarian in the UK's pig farming industry, Dr. Alice Brough. The End of Medicine is a new documentary film that highlights how the way in which we consume and treat animals in both factory farms and smaller animal farms drives the emergence of existential health threats such as zoonotic disease, including COVID-19, chronic disease, environmental racism, and antimicrobial resistance. In fact, 70% of the world's antibiotics are being used in animal agribusiness, 70%. The overuse of antibiotics in factory farmed animals is leading to widespread resistance in humans to antibiotics. So that puts us at risk of not being able to treat deadly infections in the future, hence the title, The End of Medicine. The End of Medicine as a film sounds the alarm few have heard. The film is directed by award-winning filmmaker Alex Lockwood, along with executive producers Rooney Mara and Joaquin Phoenix, along with producer Keegan Kuhn, who produced the documentaries Cowspiracy and What the Health. The End of Medicine is available on Apple TV and iTunes. The Instagram site for the film is at The End of Medicine. Our guest is the whistleblower vet who is prominently featured in the End of Medicine film, Dr. Alice Brough. Dr. Brough worked as a commercial livestock vet in the UK from 2015 to 2019, consulting on health, welfare, and productivity across all sizes and systems of pig farming. As a result of this experience, she now dedicates her life to activism for animal rights, human rights, and environmental protection. Her work with farmed pigs starkly highlighted the great risk posed to human health by our use of animals, namely from infectious disease and the severe overuse and misuse of medicines we rely on to save human lives. Dr. Brough took the opportunity to tell her story in The End of Medicine, alongside bringing a legal challenge to the UK government on the same subject. Welcome, Dr. Brough.
Thank you so much for having me. That was a lovely introduction. Thank you.
Well, I enjoyed watching the documentary in which you're prominently featured, and in it you talk about how you wanted to be a veterinarian ever since you were a little kid. So tell us why you stopped working as a commercial pig industry vet in the UK after just 4 years.
Yeah. Well, I went into the pig industry first off because I was already concerned about sort of welfare within that industry. I'd worked on sort of intensive farms as a teenager, and that was my goal, really, to work my way into it and make some changes there because I was so shocked by what I was seeing.
Right.
When I got into the industry itself as a qualified vet, these issues just blew my mind. Like I hadn't realized quite how widespread the immense suffering was. I hadn't realized how sort of dangerous the standards and the practices were in terms of their impacts on human health and the environment. And I just, about halfway through that 4 years, I went vegan myself because I realized that I was sort of paying to perpetuate these issues and in effect traumatize myself with them. And then sort of a couple of years after that, I realized I wasn't able to make any change within that industry because the system is so set in place and there is so much sort of money and lobbying power and marketing power to prevent these issues from being shown to the public. So yeah, I left and felt like sharing that story with people would be more impactful than what I could do from within.
Yeah, so rather than just switching to a different job to benefit yourself and your own sanity, you wanted to make big changes to the industry and the animals you left behind. What did you decide to do when you quit serving the pig farming industry with your veterinary skills?
Yeah, so it was really hard to walk away, actually, and I obviously I'm deeply sort of upset by the fact that I had to leave the pigs there to try and make change from the outside. But I just do what I can now in terms of activism, and that takes many, many different forms, depending on what's current and what sort of opportunities arise, like the documentary End of Medicine. And I just make a real effort to educate myself on all the issues that are affecting not just the animals, but the planet and our own species. And I take that wherever I can by, public speaking or consultation and things like that. Yeah, it's varied.
So you work with different nonprofit type groups in the UK?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I've worked with various sort of organizations and done stuff as an individual as well. And just whatever comes up really that's worth my time, I will take on.
Yeah. And this next question is, what are some of the biggest concerns you have about animal farming? And that might be part of what you're voicing in when you're public speaking, and what you talked about in the End of Medicine. So could you tell us what are some of the biggest concerns you have about animal farming, having, seen it from an employee's perspective?
Yeah, of course. Well, obviously the End of Medicine focuses predominantly on human health, but I think almost every problem, if not every problem, large problem facing society and humanity today can be strongly linked to our relationship with animals and the natural world and our sort of food system. So obviously covered within the film is our risk for infectious disease, as you said, so pandemics, and we've seen devastating effects of zoonoses throughout our lifetimes, from Ebola, SARS, HIV/AIDS, swine flu, and of course like foodborne disease, which kills hundreds of thousands of people every year from animal agriculture. We also talk about antimicrobial resistance, again, like you mentioned, which kills about 5 million people a year already, though it's not that's not a widely known fact, which,
right, that is more than I thought.
Yeah, so they released a study this year which showed that the deaths from antimicrobial resistance have jumped 7-fold from the last estimate, which was a lot more than they were expecting. And kind of the only thing that's changed in that time is the fact that we've massively increased our reliance on animals for food and intensified our agriculture. And like you said, 70% of antibiotics worldwide are given to livestock, and that's even higher in the US. So you guys actually use 80% of your antibiotics in livestock in ways which are very high risk for developing these resistant infections. So these are the two sort of main health issues, not to mention like chronic disease from our livestock heavy diets as well. But then climate change, the massive ecological emergency that we're in right now, is very, very strongly linked to livestock farming. It's the number one driver of deforestation, ocean dead zones, pollution, many issues caused by livestock farming. And that is in part because of how inefficient it is as a food system. We grow so much grain and soya and crops and everything to feed livestock, to then feed ourselves, that it's so shocking to me that hundreds of millions of people are underfed and starving, yet we can feed 80 billion land animals a year to slaughter, which
it's so inefficient. It's an inefficient use of food. Yeah,
exactly. And it's so wrong on so many levels, like the water use, the land use, the resource use, and the fact that it's a system based on the exploitation of other sentient beings who we know are intelligent and suffer in the same way that we do. Many issues.
So hard for you, because like when you become a vet, it's because you like animals and you want to provide individual care for each one. Like I'm about to take my dog Elliot to the vet next week, and I feel good about that, that he's going to be treated well. But then you're in an industry where they can't, or they choose not to it's not economical if they're in the profit business to really provide individual health care for each animal. So then as a vet, did you feel kind of used, like you weren't really there to help each individual, or, and so
it was
against maybe what you wanted to do?
Yeah, it was devastating actually for somebody who loves and cares about animals, and I spent my whole life wanting to be a vet, to then enter an industry where they are very much treated like commodities. It's it's herd health rather than individual health, and that is how you make the profit. So a lot of the time the best thing for me to do would be to euthanize animals that were suffering, because it economically didn't make sense, and it sometimes wasn't possible to treat individual animals because of the scale of the farming that they were in. So yeah, it was really hard, really sad.
Like you talk about that in The End of Medicine, that it's like you're having to kill animals every day, and that's and it's so traumatizing for you.
I mean, killing them almost felt like a mercy, considering how they were living, because it was the conditions are so awful. I can't overstate that enough. Like the misery when you walk into these sort of factory farms or slaughterhouses or breeding sheds, the misery is palpable, and the hygiene, the smell, oh god, it is just awful. And it almost felt like, well, you're probably better off being put to sleep by me than making it to the slaughterhouse,
Right. But that's right. So euthanasia really is a term for what you felt like you were doing. But well, I'm sorry that you had to experience that, and but I thank you for speaking out about these traumatic experiences. And I understand that another form of activism is you took some legal action against the UK government in terms of protecting public health. Can you tell us about that?
Yes. Yes. So they coincided, actually, The End of Medicine and this legal case, scrap factory farming, which the issues overlap massively. So if you want to really dig into the resources and facts on this, go to scrapfactoryfarming.org, and there's a whole bunch of resources there. But so this is actually a human rights case, which is a legal challenge to get the government to recognise and act on the risks posed by factory farming specifically. Now, we took that to the UK government, and they managed to sort of brush it off because there is already a framework in place. That was their whole defense. We submitted 1,200 pages of scientific evidence, a lot of which was quoting their own scientists back to them. They did not refute any of the science or the evidence. They simply said, well, we've got a framework in place, which obviously is not working, but that was their defense. So we're now actually applying to the European Court of Human Rights, so going above the UK government on that one. So watch this space for that one.
But I'm glad that you did that, because you forced these issues into the legal system to say, and it was a variety of issues. Was it mostly the public health part that you're emphasizing, or was it the environmental part, or?
Mostly public health. You have to be quite specific on sort of calling for a judicial review. It has to be very specific things that they've failed to do. So we went with the human rights, human health angle as the most likely to be picked up and the most likely to be supported by the public. It's very hard to actually get public support on matters of animal welfare or matters of environment when it doesn't. I think in England we're we're kind of protected from the climate emergency a little bit at the moment, although we're not, but people are quite separate from it. So I think focusing on the human health issues in the middle of a pandemic was going to be our best shot.
I know it is kind of sad, because if we're not going to deal with the prevention part now related to preventing future pandemics, when there's a huge public will after all we've suffered and continue to suffer, when are they going to do something about it? Because I am very concerned that everything is just business as usual with animal agribusiness and with just trade and wildlife and everything. And that's why I dedicate so many of these radio shows to this topic. I'm like, okay, we know this is a problem, but what are we doing?
Exactly. And it could be much worse than COVID-19. I think that's the main point to get across, is that COVID-19, although it's ground the world to a halt completely, has a pretty low mortality rate. But the things that we're actually predicting to be the most likely next pandemic or a disaster waiting to happen in these factory farms, exactly, an influenza, which spillover events of avian influenza in the past few years have carried a mortality of 60%, which if that mutated in a way that it was able to spread like COVID-19, that would be 60% of people getting that disease, dying, which
Yeah, I mean, think
is
how
so
we've,
frightening.
like completely altered everything about human society across the
Uh-huh.
world for COVID-19 when the mortality rate was actually fairly low, and then
Mhm,
good that it's low, but future pandemics, like you mentioned, are
mhm,
could be just devastating. And so, right, we
exactly.
should be doing all we can. And so I'm
Mhm,
glad you're raising the alarm
mhm.
for that. If you're just joining us on Radio Free Georgia, this is In Tune to Nature. I'm host Carrie Freeman, talking about the new documentary, The End of Medicine, with one of its star experts, UK farmed animal veterinarian, Dr. Alice Brough. The Instagram site for the documentary, which airs on iTunes and Apple TV, is at The End of Medicine. Dr. Brough, as one of the experts featured in the new documentary, The End of Medicine, what would you say people will gain further understanding from watching the End of Medicine documentary in terms of like why it's worth watching?
Mhm. I think it does a really good job of getting a variety of people to speak on the
Yeah.
issues covered in the documentary. So we've got doctors, we've got vets, we've got environmentalists, we've got politicians, we've got activists, a huge host of people speaking on these issues. And it kind of dives deep into issues that have not really been spoken about so much. We've all experienced this pandemic. We know that 5 million people a year are dying from antimicrobial resistance, but nobody's really talking about how we're going to prevent that from getting any worse or prevent a future pandemic in an effective way. A lot of our policies are reactive, and none of them actually have any capacity to prevent sort of societal collapse from all these issues. So
Yeah.
um, it does a really nice job of looking at stories as well as facts, and it doesn't feel like a biased film. I don't know whether you got that kind of vibe from it, but I thought it was just quite a balanced take.
I
And it's
appreciate
just,
having lots of experts
yeah,
speak
yeah.
and share their opinions about about all these issues. And so you're
Mhm.
right. I think that's an important part to any documentary.
Yeah, and I think it ties in all the issues as well. Like, we're very guilty, I think, as a society of picking out individual issues and trying to look at those as singular
Mm.
things, but actually the environmental issues, the social justice issues, the human health issues, whether that's from a diet or infectious disease or whatever, they're actually all completely interlinked. And I think the film ties that in a way that it makes it clear that we as individuals actually have some power over all these things. Like, we can affect change as individuals and as a community and society, without relying upon our governments. And as it says in the film, our governments are heavily lobbied by meat, dairy, egg industries, and you're just not going to get the right policies from them to save the human race. It sounds extreme, but it's important that we kind of understand all these issues for ourselves and know how to take action and know where to look and educate ourselves on that.
Right.
Don't know
Like,
whether that
yeah, the
answered your
film,
question, Carrie.
like the film, you reminded me that it talks about environmental racism and it brings in some of the
Uh-huh.
environmental risks, even though it starts off mostly focusing on public health. So that
Mm-hmm.
it has more of a holistic, look at some of the problems of the current food system that's
Mm-hmm.
based largely around um, raising just raising animals in general, and also
Mm-hmm.
feeding all those animals. But what do you recommend we do as a society to rectify the problems with farming animals, since right now our food system is kind of built so heavily around animal farming?
Yeah, it is, sadly. So I think fundamentally the problems we're talking about cannot be alleviated within animal farming. There's no way of farming animals, there's no way of exploiting animals. We're talking beyond agriculture. We're talking about fashion, research, exotic pet trade, etc. All these ways that we're exploiting animals are creating risks for us, and we can't alleviate those problems completely whilst continuing those things. So we must sort of look to rely more on plant foods. We must look for alternatives to using animals in whatever way we're using them, particularly as a sort of Western society, fairly privileged, you know, anyone who's in a privileged position to be able to make these choices for themselves. Right. There are many ways that we can look to do that. And that in itself will then drive policy change. It's very, very difficult to, you know, we've tried it with the legal case, but the government policy changes usually when the money kind of goes towards something else. You know, they're not going to subsidize healthy plant foods until we show that there's a demand for those things.
Right. That's a very good way of putting it. That kind of shows the political will follows the public opinion. And so
yeah,
you know, we have to take responsibility through collective action to say we want changes in food. We want healthy, tasty, nutritious, organic, plant-based foods to be highly accessible, you know, anywhere. And, you know, right now it's like to be vegan is an inconvenience a lot of times, you know, like you go out of your way or whatever. And it's like, it shouldn't be. To do the right thing, that should be the default, right? That the governments and everything's set up as the default way to do things, the easy, affordable way to do things.
Yeah, exactly. And kind of those of us in a position to do so, we can start to educate ourselves on perhaps how we might help people to feed themselves cheaply on a healthy plant-based diet, how we might sort of create systems which are healthier for the environment and that sort of thing. I don't know, I'm halfway through a book at the moment which is phenomenal that I'm going to mention because everyone needs to read it immediately. It's called Regenesis by George Monbiot. I don't know if you know of him at all.
Oh, okay. The author, like the op-ed writer, columnist.
Yeah, exactly. So this book Regenesis just covers absolutely every issue, particularly the environmental stuff, as that's his thing, but it's so well put together, and the references section is like almost the size of a whole book. So it's a really good really good resource for looking at solutions as well. Okay. Yes,
gonna look that up. And is there any last thing you want to add, Dr. Brough, for listeners who are interested in making systemic changes to animal farming in support of health and welfare? Any type of action or activism you might recommend for individuals besides reading that book and watching The End of Medicine?
Yeah. I mean, the first thing we've already said, the main thing to do is to choose not to fund these industries if we're in a position to do so. In terms of activism, you know, everybody's different. Everybody responds to different things. So variety is really important. If you are able to educate yourself, share information with people in your sphere and create a bit of a ripple effect, that's a brilliant way to begin. If you want to get into more sort of bigger activism, look at organizations in your area, look at groups you can join, people that you can chat to about that. And just think about I think we've moved away a little bit from sort of unleashing our imaginations, if that makes sense. Like we've kind of got into a bit of a position because of how the system is set up of not using our imagination. So looking at our unique sort of skill set and personalities in ways that we might be able to affect change effectively. There is another really good book called Change of Heart by Nick Cooney, which goes into the psychology of social change, which is I think a really good read for anybody who's looking to go into any sort of activism or even just have really, you know, productive conversations with people around them.
Yeah, I've assigned that in some of my communication classes on social change, the Heart book.
Great.
Well, that's great. Well, that's the end of our show, but I want to thank you, Dr. Alice Brough, for being with us on Radio Free Georgia's In Tune to Nature program. And thank you for being brave enough to speak out against the health and welfare problems with animal farming.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for having me. There's so much to it. It's really hard to kind of pick out key bits to talk about, but I hope that was all right.
Well, it's just the start for you. You have a lifetime to, you know, to work on it.
For sure.
Well,
take
care.
Yeah, you too. Thank you so much.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to In Tune to Nature, broadcasting every Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time, online at wrfg.org and on Atlanta radio station 89.3 FM. We post action items, news, and podcasts on the show's website, facebook.com/In Tune to Nature. The views and opinions expressed on this show do not necessarily reflect those of WRFG, its board, staff, or volunteers. I'm one of those volunteers. I'm host Carrie Freeman, asking you to please support independent, non-commercial media like Radio Free Georgia. And remember to take care of yourself and others, including other species. Thanks for listening. Cheers.